price of action is colossal, and we are going to hell.
More Than Lock Your Doors, submitted by Carol Y. This story started when I was a little girl, but continued into my late teens. The first house my parents bought when I was 5 years old. Up until that time, we'd been living in apartments, and my parents found a house they really liked for what I now understand was a very cheap price. I had no idea about the history of the house at the time, but I would find out later why the price was so right. When we first moved in, I really loved it. My sister and I had our own rooms, we had a big backyard to play in, and I was just starting school. There were new kids in the neighborhood that became my fast friends, and it was just so much nicer than living in the apartment we had been living in before. I mean, this was a long time ago, but even at that age, I could appreciate why my parents bought the house. They bought it in August, and we moved in just in time for school to start. And around that time, I started to wake up in the night and see a woman standing in my room. It wasn't all ghostly or anything. It looked like a real woman with long, scraggly hair standing there, holding something in her hand. Even though I was scared, I would usually just close my eyes, and after a while when I opened them, the woman would be gone. I told my parents, and they told me it was just a dream and that I shouldn't eat as many sweets as I did before bed. Honestly, it did feel like a dream, so I listened to them, and when I would wake up, my room would be empty. A dream it must have been. But around Christmas time, it happened again. I woke up, and there stood this woman. In the dark, I could see she was holding a hammer. And that really scared me, and I screamed. I closed my eyes and heard my dad running up from the basement. He'd been down there putting together some of our toys for Christmas, and my mom was at work at the time. She worked an overnight shift as an ER nurse. I should mention that my bedroom was the only bedroom on the first floor. My parents were wary about me being there, away from my sister and them when I slept, but I loved all the windows and begged for that room. When I heard my dad running up the stairs, I opened my eyes and the woman was gone. My dad came in asking if everything was okay, what was wrong, and he had a frantic look on his face. I told him that the woman I had told him about before was back in my room, and it wasn't a dream. My dad flicked the lights on instead of just standing with the hall light on and looked down at my floor. He didn't say anything right away, but even at 5, I looked around and saw wet footprints on my carpet. They came and went out from my door. My dad told me to stay where I was and turned around and went into the hall and was gone for a minute. He was checking the doors and windows and also on my sister. She had woken up from my scream all the way upstairs. Then I heard my dad make a phone call to my mom, and I overheard him saying he didn't want to scare her, but something happened and he didn't want her to not know that he was calling the police. I couldn't make out much of the conversation, but I did pick up on the words footprints, and I heard him saying, "I don't know, all the doors are locked." My dad did call the police, and in the middle of the night, there they were, talking while my sister and I had hot cocoa in the kitchen. The police were very nice and asked me questions about what I saw, and I also mentioned at that point that I had seen the woman before, but had thought it was a dream. My dad had his hand on my shoulder and said, "Yeah, that is true," but at the time, he figured it was a dream. The police looked around and then looked around outside. There wasn't much to look at. The grass was wet, but this was in the south and we didn't have any snow or anything like that. The police talked to my dad again and then left saying to call if anything else happened. My dad was and is a great guy, and he knew that my sister and I were shook up. It was about 1:30 in the morning at this point, and neither of us could sleep. So my dad did his best and made a game out of it. He said we could all sleep in his room and watch a video on my parents' TV. He propped up all of the pillows to make a sort of makeshift fort to protect us, and then he made us some popcorn too. We all eventually fell asleep and were woken up by my mom when she came home in the morning. Christmas came and was awesome, and eventually all of this was forgotten by me and my sister. But every once in a while, my dad and mom would have a conversation that we weren't supposed to listen to. It wasn't until later in life that he told me that they had been talking about the owners of the house previous to us moving in. My dad was an avid hunter and had lots of guns he kept in a safe in the basement. When I was a little older, I learned that he kept one in his sock drawer, a .45 he would later teach me to shoot. So the years went rolling by and nothing else happened in the house, and my childhood was really great. All of the things that had happened were forgotten, and my sister and I just grew up with awesome parents, great friends. We loved our school, we were really involved there, and it was just a great place to live. That is, until my freshman year of college when I came home for Christmas break. My mom had changed my room around a little bit, but it was still a bedroom, and that's where I would stay when I was home. I still loved all those windows. One night during the week between Christmas and New Year's, I was talking to my new boyfriend who lived about an hour away. I was hoping he would come over to meet my parents during the break, and we were planning that visit. We talked into the late night and eventually hung up. I got up to get a drink of water, brushed my teeth, and was really tired from the day and just fell asleep with all of my clothes on while I laid on my bed. Sometime in the night, I heard a noise that woke me up. Usually I slept with a radio on. I love talk radio, and now I fall asleep listening to your stories, Uncle Josh. But this sounded like my door opening, and it was enough to wake me up. I opened my eyes and cleared out some of the sleep to see a woman with long, scraggly hair standing in my bedroom. I froze, a scream stuck in my throat that wouldn't come out. It was the same woman. She looked a lot older, but it was the same woman. And the shock of my life came when I saw that she was holding a hammer in her hand. I sat there frozen, staring at her as she just stared back at me. She didn't say a word, just stood there staring at me. I started to speak, and she raised her arm up with the hammer. Now I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, and the woman stopped raising her arm and put her other hand to her mouth with a finger up in front of her lips and said, "It'll be over in a second." I sat up in bed, and she sort of moved towards me, and I heard my father running to my room. He got there and flicked the lights on, and I could see he was holding up his .45. He was also taken aback by the woman standing in my room. For a second, nothing happened until he screamed, "Who the fuck are you? Get away from my daughter!" At that point, he was now pointing the gun at the woman's back, as she hadn't even bothered to turn and look at him. Dad wasn't waiting for her to respond. He slammed his knee into the back of her knee, and she fell over with a yell onto the ground, dropping the hammer. My mother came up behind my dad, and my father screamed, "Sherry, call the fucking cops!" The woman just lay there on the ground, not saying anything, but kind of crying. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I peed my pants, I was so afraid. So my mom was freaking out as she called 911, and my sister wasn't home, and the only other thing going bonkers was my golden retriever, funnily enough named Bonkers. Bonky kept trying to get by my dad to get to me, but he was holding him back, keeping his .45 pointed at this woman laying on the floor. A few minutes later, the police arrived and got the woman up and out of my room. She didn't say anything at first, but just looked at me with these crazy eyes and said, "It would have been over in a second." I had no idea what she meant, but I think she was inferring that she was going to kill me. Yeah, that's a little bit of a thought to have as a late teenager. Long story short, this woman had lived in the house before my parents had bought it. She had always been a disturbed young girl who never got treatment because her parents were also really messed up. She had once tried attacking her mother with a hammer, so they kept her locked in a room in the house for 15 years of her life, until other family members stepped in and got her removed for treatment. She severely needed that treatment. Something happened to the parents, and some other issues came up with the house, and I don't really know what happened to them, but I know they lost custody of the girl, and they were forced to sell the house. Now here's the kicker. This woman had been let out of a treatment facility on her own recognizance. She was now in her early 30s, and come to find out that when I was 5, she had actually escaped from the same place. So basically, she got out twice. And here's the other kicker. My parents had never changed the locks on the house. This crazy woman had remembered a spare key that her parents had hidden somewhere outside near our back door. She had simply just gotten the key and gotten into our house. I mean, how fucked up is that? And how fucked up is it that every time she came in, when she left, she put the key back in its hidden spot? I suppose the early lesson here is change your locks the minute you get a new place. The police arrested her, and the whole rigmarole started all over again, with her not being competent to stand trial, and she was remanded to another mental health facility. She's still there now, and while we couldn't prove that she was going to harm or kill me, the prosecutors made a good case that she at least was posing a very dangerous threat, and that she remained locked up in the facility without the possibility of getting out again. I don't know how any of that works, but this last thing happened about 25 years ago, and like I said, as far as I know, she's still where she was. After I graduated from college, my parents sold the place, and all of us moved to different states. I don't think we had anything to do with this woman personally. She was just going back to the only place she knew. Where she got the hammer, nobody knew. It was not one of ours. Now I have my own family, and I made sure to change the locks on both of the houses I've lived in. My sister and I still tease my parents for not changing the locks in the first place on that first house. I mean, after all of this time, we can sort of joke about it. But the truth is, sometimes in the night I do wake up and think that I see that woman standing in my room. I know she's not there, but I guess it's something that will always be stuck in my mind and in my dreams for the rest of my life. Sometimes you can't call the cops for help by "don't want them to find me." My apologies for the length of this story. I've tried to cut it down some, but it's simply a long story. I'm hoping this is vague enough to remain anonymous, because those involved are still out there somewhere, and I'd really prefer not to encounter them again. However, I will say that this story happened in the U.S. For reference, I was 20 years old at the time, living in an apartment with my mom and little brother while I attended community college. When we first moved in, the apartments were very well run, but within a short time the managers were transferred elsewhere, and the replacements did not have the skill at keeping undesirable types of people out. The police became a regular sight in our neighborhood, and it was a rare day that would go by without seeing them. The woman who moved in downstairs from us began openly dealing drugs, and people would come and go at all hours and leave, stuffing little bags of various substances into their pockets. Mostly weed, but definitely other stuff as well. They couldn't have been more obvious if they tried, and there was always a crowd of shady-looking men with large, unfriendly dogs hanging around the yard, or even sitting on our stairs. They'd act like it was a personal insult if we interrupted them to walk up or down the stairs, and would just generally be quite intimidating. The breaking point didn't come until their customers started getting the wrong address and coming to our door instead. We'd be sitting in the living room and hear footsteps come up the stairs, and the door handle would jiggle against the lock. We became religious about keeping the door locked tight. One night I was home alone, and somebody started just beating on the door, not knocking. It was more like he thought it was a punching bag, all the while screaming barely comprehensible obscenities. I grabbed the biggest butcher knife out of the kitchen and shouted through the door that I was calling 911, and he ran away. In hindsight, I probably should have called, but I was just relieved he was gone, and since I hadn't seen what he looked like, I figured it wouldn't have been that much use. After that, though, I always pushed the couch in front of the door before I went to bed. My mom had had enough of this at this point. She tried going to the manager first, and it was met with a total lack of interest from her. So she decided there was nothing to be done but contact the police about it herself. So she called about it, and she got off the phone looking happy because at least they seemed to take her seriously and promised to investigate. The first sign of trouble came the next night. There was a lot of thumping and bumping downstairs, and a peek out of the window showed people going in and out of the apartment, carrying cardboard boxes to a dented van on the street. Bright and early the next morning, the police raided the place, and you guessed it, clean as a whistle. At first, we didn't realize the implication of this. When it started back up again a few days later, my mom called the cops again, and the same thing happened. At this point, we realized it probably wasn't a coincidence. Somebody in the local police department was most likely tipping them off. One of the curses of a small town. I was angry and disappointed, but at least we tried, right? It never hurts to try. I wish. About a week later, I was getting ready for an evening class, and I had just gotten out of the shower and was in my bedroom in a bathrobe, picking out what I wanted to wear. I heard a loud banging on the front door, but I didn't think much of it. We'd been expecting a package from the UPS man, and he always knocked loudly. My mom's footsteps went to answer it, and I heard her say something. I couldn't make out the words, but her tone caught my attention, and I felt like something was wrong. I reached for my doorknob, but before I could open it, it flew open in my face, and all my shocked brain could grasp was, "Huge man with a gun in my room," before I was grabbed by the shoulders and flung to the floor. I honestly thought the drug users downstairs had come to get us once and for all. I thought I was going to be raped and murdered. At this point, I should mention I had an issue with one of my wrists for years due to a childhood injury. I'd had it operated on twice, and this was not more than a few months after the second operation. Naturally, I managed to land with my full weight on that wrist, and something crunched horribly. I did what any tough person would do and immediately burst into tears and sat there clutching my wrist waiting to die. I guess I must not have looked very threatening like that, because he stepped back a little bit, and that's when I saw "police" on the front of his vest. The next few minutes were a bit of a blur. Somehow I was hurled into my living room where my mom was, and the cop left without saying more than, "Wait here." I was completely dazed. My mom was pretty much having hysterics, and there were all kinds of shouting and activity going on outside. After a short while, the cop returned and informed us, to paraphrase, "Sorry, wrong address. Shit happens. We can't be perfect all the time. My name is Officer Shinkin. Here's my card, and you can call it if you have any questions." And then he just left. I went straight to the emergency room and spent the next 2 hours getting my wrist x-rayed and put into a splint. And then I went to math class because, I didn't know what else to do, and I was terrified of being at home. Needless to say, I learned nothing whatsoever, but the support of my teacher and classmates was reassuring. The next morning, somebody knocked on the door. When my mom answered, it was Officer Shinkin again. When I heard his voice, I started hyperventilating and went to hide in the bathroom, so I didn't hear what was said, but I heard when my mom slammed the door. She was absolutely furious. I'd never seen her look so angry. Apparently, good old Officer Shinkin brought along a carefully prepared document that we were to sign. It basically said we understood that it was all a terrible mistake and that we would not be seeking legal action. She told him to go to hell and shut the door in his face. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. It was one of the nurses at the emergency room saying somebody claiming to be law enforcement had just come by trying to get copies of my emergency room visit records. But they didn't have permission to release those, and if I wanted him to have them, I'd have to come by and sign the forms. Oh, hell no. Further questions realized that, yes, the man's description matched Officer Shinkin, and yes, he was not the officer involved, but was investigating the incident. I started to find that pretty much everyone that I told my story to would get a funny look on their face and say, "This cop, was his name Officer Shinkin?" And then they would launch into their own horror story about him. My high school teacher said that he shot one of her former students during a marijuana bust and left him on the ground to bleed to death, but another officer on the scene did first aid and saved his life. One of our neighbors said he dragged said neighbor's uncle down a flight of stairs by his feet, hitting his head on every concrete step. Another neighbor said Officer Shinkin pulled them out of their shower by his hair and held a gun to his head over a parole violation. And a Google search said he'd once been fired from a nearby city for shooting a handcuffed man in the head, killing him. He claimed it was somehow self-defense and was fired but never charged with any crime. The medical bills for the ER visit ended up being over $7,000, and I didn't have insurance, so basically I had no choice but to file a suit. I found myself a lawyer and submitted a claim, and that's when shit really hit the fan. We started getting disturbing phone calls at all hours of the night, sometimes just silence at the other end or the sound of somebody breathing, and sometimes graphically sexual comments. When we stopped answering the phone, they just let it ring until the machine picked up, and then immediately hung up and then did it again. My mom went to her car one morning and opened the door only to discover the handle had been covered with some sort of caustic chemical. She washed it off but still ended up with burns in an emergency room visit. I had just gotten my permit and was out for driving practice when it began to rain as I went down the highway. I flipped on the windshield wipers and discovered they'd been coated with grimy motor oil. It smeared across the windshield and completely obscured my vision. Fortunately, the road was empty enough that I was able to slam on the brakes and pull to the side of the road without getting into an accident. Other things started happening too, less severe but sinister given the context above. Somebody cut out a bunch of metal malicious skull designs and tacked them onto our wall or pushed them under the door at night. I mean, what the fuck? I still have no idea what that was supposed to accomplish. Furniture was stolen off the porch, my boots vanished when I left them out there once, and oddly, several pounds of weed in a plastic sack appeared on our porch one morning. My mom called the manager to get it without going outside, and for once in her life, the lady did something useful and actually fetched it and threw it in the dumpster. I have never felt so hopeless in my life. I mean, what was I going to do, call the police? It was around this time that a friend who lived abroad suggested I come stay with him for a while for my own safety. I dropped out of school and left the country for 6 months while the lawsuit worked its way through the courts. My mother and brother moved in with family and then to another town without submitting a forwarding address. Eventually, my tourist visa ran out and I had to come home. I was a complete nervous wreck and I ended up settling out of court for a relatively small sum of money just to make it over. My lawyer had gotten a copy of the search warrant they'd used, and it was riddled with grammatical errors and switched my apartment number 18 and the number of the unit down the street 25 at random. The suspect was somebody with an entirely different name who looked entirely different from any of us, and who apparently sold some Oxycontin pills. She lived in Unit 25. I saw a copy of her driver's license. It said right on the front of it in nice clear letters, Unit 25 as her address. I don't know, I have no proof, but it was obvious that somebody had been tipping off our drug dealers downstairs, and I often wonder if that wrong number on the warrant was not a mistake at all. Perhaps it was meant as a retaliation for trying to get their friends in trouble. I've now regained full use of my hand, which my doctor had told me might never happen. I no longer have a heart attack at loud noises, and I only feel slightly uneasy when I see police uniforms, rather than having full-on panic attacks. It's 6 years later, and I'm only now beginning to reclaim my life, kick the PSD, and go back to finish school. I feel like I lost the best part of my 20s to these jerks, and I'm still bitter about it. I currently live with friends in an informal situation. My real address is not on any documentation, and I get all my mail in a P.O. box in another town. Depending on which document you're looking at, I supposedly live in 5 different places scattered from one end of the country to another. And I'm not going to change that until I move a lot further away from where all this happened. As far as I know, nobody involved ever faced any sort of consequences. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on my podcast or channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Thought I would throw a little best of the best in here. The story about Officer Shinkin is one that I've always loved but never did, and those of you in the Campfire crew who have been around for a little while know that I like to throw in some of the classics. Hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Follow me on social media. All of the links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to take it a step further in your support, find me on Patreon. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.